Hello YouTube friends, welcome back to Future Fiber. This is your host Jenny. This is a channel where I do mostly fiber related crafts, mostly knitting at this point. And today we're going to be doing something very interesting, at least for me. I don't know about you guys. Something that's been in the news a lot recently is AI, for good reason or bad reason. I thought today though that we could put it to a fun use and ask ChatGPT to write a knitting pattern for us. So at this point, I realized that I never explained what ChatGPT actually is. Taken from our good friend Wikipedia, ChatGPT is an artificial intelligence chatbot developed by OpenAI. Basically what it is you ask it questions and it answers them in a conversational manner based on its database. So I'm not the one who came up with this idea. I actually saw it on Instagram Reels, and I believe it was a fork over from their TikTok. But I thought since that video was for crochet, it would be interesting to do it for knitting as well. And there are some criterias, right? Like, obviously, I don't want to knit a whole sweater just to find out that it's going to have 8 arms. I had already given this a brief go off camera. And I found that when I just asked
ChatGPT, could you write me a knitting pattern, please?
It would ask me more questions about what I wanted to knit. So I'm going to try and give it some guidance and see if it can produce some results that would be knittable in a couple of days. So I have this yarn here today. Feels like Butta from Lion's brand. That's going to be 218 yards or 199 meters. So I have my laptop here with me. I'm going to record my screen and I guess we'll just keep the recording running and see what happens. All right, let's start by putting in the yarn information. Can you write me a knitting pattern for medium weight yarn using 199 meters of medium weight yarn? Can you write me a knitting pattern using 199 meters of medium weight yarn? I think that sounds reasonable. Let's give it a go. Okay, it's thinking. Okay, we got a cowl. 4.5, yeah, okay, that's exactly the knitting needle size that's recommended for this. 120 stitches. Well, that sounds like a lot. Okay, join in the round. We're knitting in the round. Okay, so knit 2, purl 2. That means it's going to be a rib, 12 inches. 12 inches of rib. And then until you have used up most of your yarn, leaving enough to bind off. Oh. Hey, this sounds really normal. This is just a tube that's, knit 2, purl 2, rib. And it's a cowl. 120 stitches. I feel like that should work. Oh, and it even tells you here, if you have leftover yarn, you could also add a pom-pom or a tassel to the bottom for a fun touch if you prefer, and it even has little notes. But this sounds a little bit too boring. I wanted a chaotic result, like an octopus with 8 arms. So let's see if it'll give us another option to knit. Can you give me a more can you write me a more advanced pattern using the same amount and weight of yarn? Okay. Let's see. Okay, so materials. So what I'm noticing immediately is that this is really the format of it is following a standard knitting pattern, right? You usually have like the materials up top and then you have the instructions and you would have like maybe schematics, but I guess like it's not generating that because it doesn't know what that is. But what I'm surprised about is that it's using all the right all the right terminology, which I guess it makes sense. It's like trained probably on free knitting patterns that are available on the web. Oh my god, okay. So now we have cable. We have cables. I'm so scared. Okay, let's see. Oh, this is interesting. This is different. Okay, so it's still recommending a cowl, but if you look here, this one even gives you a gauge. I feel like up here, you didn't get gauge. Why did that happen? I don't know. Also, how does it know? The gauge part is a little bit interesting, right? Because it says in stockinette stitch, but then the pattern it's suggesting is not stockinette, because it has the 2x2 rib, and then the cable pattern is obviously not stockinette. So I don't know why it's giving me the gauge in stockinette. That's very interesting. Okay, so let's read through this really quickly, make sure it would, do something. Okay, so we have knit 2, purl 2, rib for approximately 3 inches, which is about yay long. And then we're going to have cable. Okay, we're gonna knit 2, purl 2, slip 2 stitches onto cable needle and hold it in the back, knit 2 from cable needle. I'm not sure I would have written this like that. So this part confuses me a little bit because it's saying end with rows 1 and 2 of the ribbing pattern. So that's talking about the top here, row 1 and 2, but it doesn't tell you that this is a rib pattern, but it mentions it down here as ribbing. I mean, I know that because I know how to knit, but would somebody new know how to do that? I'm not sure. Your cowl is now complete. Okay, so here. The problem is now it doesn't tell you to join in the round, so this is actually going to be a rectangle. Just a scarf. That's interesting. I would be curious to know if their yarn estimates are correct. Very interesting. So I am going to knit that second pattern, I guess. Exactly as ChatGPT told me to make it. And we'll reconvene and see what the final result is. I will see you once I've started casting on. So I actually decided that I would make the gauge swatch as recommended by the pattern. I don't think it'll be very helpful given that, the actual pattern itself is cabled and this is recommending that I do a stockinette gauge, but for the sake of giving it a fair chance, I'm going to make sure that I hit gauge and whatever. So we will see what happens. Okay, hello. I have made the gauge swatch. Nobody judge me for my terrible tension. I don't knit very well in the flat, but I measured it, and I have, let's see, how many stitches here? I have 20 stitches and 24 rows for a 4x4. Well, this is not 4 inches long, but I was not gonna knit that much for this exercise. The gauge that was given by ChatGPT was 21 stitches and 30 rows. The stitch gauge is actually pretty good. The row gauge is massively off. I guess there is a possibility that if I washed and blocked this could grow, but I still don't think it's gonna get to 30 rows. So I might run out of yarn, since I'm going to have more rows to get to whatever distance that the pattern wants me to get to, so might not be the most accurate measure of the pattern, but I mean, I think it's fine. This is just for fun anyways, so we'll see how it goes. So now I'm casting on, and I am also putting in stitch markers for every 20 stitches because I don't trust my brain to keep track of 120 stitches. I'm not very good at counting. The first part of the instructions says row 1, right side, knit 2, purl 2, repeat to the end of the row. So I'm going to be doing that, and once I've done the first part, I will come back. New day, and I finished the first round, or not round, first repeat of the cable section, as the pattern calls it, and I'm feeling a little like I'm confused. Maybe I need to knit more to actually see the pattern. It is also totally possible that there is no pattern. Let me show you what I have. So this is 6 row repeat, and this is the current state of my knitting. And it says it's supposed to be a cable pattern. Can you spot the cable? The cabling is at the beginning of the, let me switch cameras so that you can get a better look. Okay, so here we are. The cabling is at the beginning of the section repeat. So you can see here that this is twisted. So you can kind of see it here, but this rib isn't being continued to kind of make that standard cable shape. So it's getting lost. I don't know what this stitch is called. It kind of looks like a moss stitch or seed stitch, but like two stitch seed stitch. So you can see that the knits and purls are being broken up the rows, so you can't really tell where the cable is. And I'm not sure if this is going to just be more apparent as I keep knitting, or if, I mean, there's no intention, right? Like the AI has no intention because it's not human, so it's not doing this knowing what this would look like once it's knitted up. So that's pretty interesting that it chose to do this like moss stitch pattern, but then also added cabling. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to keep doing this until the pattern suggests, and then it's like, I think you do the repeat until you have approximately 12 inches of height on this cowl. I think that's 2 inches including the rib section, so the rib section was 3, so I have about 9 inches of this to go. And then I'll report back and we'll see how it turns out. Maybe this will surprise me if I, knit the whole full length of it. Maybe I'll see this cabling pattern that I can't see right now. So I will report back once I've done that. I finished. Okay, so are you guys ready for the grand reveal of my cowl that ChatGPT generated for me? Ta-da! Here's my cowl. So I have a lot to say. And I took some notes while I was knitting this up, and you probably saw some of the clips of me talking about the progress of me knitting this guy. But I also tried to organize my thoughts so that I could share with you my, I don't know, recap on the experience, I guess. So I think right off, I have to start with the bad news, and that this was so miserable to knit. Listen, there's some things that you don't realize as a person until you try new experiences. And what I learned from this experience was that I'm a very like visual based person. So I realized that part of the things that make knitting patterns easy to knit for me is being able to predict the next stitch based on looking at the previous stitches that I've done. And that was so hard for this pattern. It might have something to do with the fact that I didn't know what the final result was gonna look like, but also the pattern itself was a 6-row repeat, but I wasn't able to see any specific patterns in over those rows, where it made it really hard for me to predict what I was supposed to be doing next. So I knit exactly 12 inches of this cowl, and I couldn't tell you the pattern. I couldn't tell you like what the stitches are supposed to be. This doesn't look like any existing stitch pattern that I know of, so it was so hard for me to knit. I had to think back so many rows, so many stitches. The only reason why I would know that I made a mistake basically was I would get to the end of the row and I would look at the pattern and I would say, oh, that's not the right stitch that I ended on. So I would have to stare at the row, count back and see where I made the mistake, put in a little stitch marker and think back to that mistake and then do it all over again. So there's no mistakes in here. This is how ChatGPT had designed the pattern. And once I finished, I started seeing this kind of almost like a basket stitch kind of pattern, but it's not made in the way that a traditional basket stitch would be made in knitting. So once again, it was so hard for me to predict what my next row was going to be. So I didn't memorize any of the pattern basically, even though I knitted so much of this. And I want to speak a little bit more to there not really seeming to be a pattern row over row. How ChatGPT works is that it's basically every next word that it's making in the sentence is taking the best guess based on its database that it was trained on. So it totally makes sense that I think in a row, the stitch repeat being like consistent, but it's also not really thinking about the cowl, the piece as like a whole design, right? So I think it totally makes sense that row over row, there's no visible like thought to what the pattern is supposed to look like. But it makes sense that there is this kind of vertical repeat that is happening because it was repeating every 6 rows. So I think that's why it still has this kind of geometrical shape to it. Then that just happened to basically I feel like I know that there was no intention from ChatGPT to make this kind of pattern, I guess. It is kind of cool looking, but I will be honest with you, this is not really something that I would choose to knit if I knew what it looked like. It looks pretty erratic. I'm sure you'll get a better look in the insert. You would have gotten a better look in the inserts that I put in of the close-up shots of this cowl, but I don't know. Overall, the proportions are really strange. So it ends in this 2x2 rib repeat on the top a little bit, and then it has this 3 inches of rib on the bottom, so that like when you have it around your neck, I guess proportion wise it doesn't seem intentional. I mean, it's not intentional, I keep saying that, but it doesn't seem purposeful, right? So I would imagine that the rib would maybe be the same length on top so that you get this vertical evenness of the distribution of the stitches, so you have more visual, I don't know, harmony, I guess, of the piece as a whole. The most important thing, I think, was that there was a straight up mistake in this pattern, and that is that this is not a cowl. I think typically, I think cowls either they have to be around your neck, and it's kind of like a tube shape, right? So you either knit in the round or you, at the end, join the piece in the round. But there was no part of the instruction that recommended you do that, or to add any sort of closure that you kind of tie around your neck or something to make a loop. So that is a straight up mistake as far as, knitting a cowl. You saw as I was generating the pattern and playing around with it that the original headband pattern that it had made in the beginning before it generated this cowl pattern, it did tell you to join in the round before you started knitting the piece. So I guess it understood, but I guess it makes sense that from a headpiece, for most headpiece instructions that it was probably trained on, it included that as part of the instruction. So it knew to include that, but who knows why it didn't put that in. I'm sure I could have told it, hey, I think that's wrong, and it would have corrected itself. But the experiment was to knit based on what it generated first, basically. So that's an interesting mistake that I caught. I've said a lot of negatives about this pattern that ChatGPT generated for us, but I do have a positive that I do want to mention. So the repeat of the stitch pattern per row was calculated correctly. So what that means is if the pattern instructs knit 2, purl 2 until the end of the row, it ended with a purl 2, and it didn't end on a weird number like knit 1. So I guess, it's a computer, right? So it knows exactly how to divide the stitch pattern in a way that it fills that 120 stitches, I guess, repeats over that seamlessly, which I thought was pretty cool because, I always have a problem with that whenever I'm knitting. I always end up with like a weird, I don't know. So ChatGPT is better at math than I am. Good to know, right? So what do you think? Is this something that you would knit? I don't know if I would knit this again. I'm going to be totally honest with you. I will keep this because I think it's really interesting and an interesting piece of experiment, even if I don't necessarily think these cable patterns that it put in there are that great, but I think it was a really interesting experiment for sure. So for those who actually do want to give this pattern a go, I have made this pattern into a PDF that is downloadable for free on my Ravelry page. And for those who don't have access to Ravelry, I will also put it on some other method where you could get it. So if you do give this a go, please let me know and what your experience is like. I am so curious to see what you think of it. Okay, so I was actually going to end the video there with just a nice little review of my experience, how that went. But I personally think it's interesting and worthwhile talking about the ethical question around AI. A quick disclaimer here, I am by no means an expert in what I am talking about here, and unless the quotes are directly pulled from a source, anything else I add is just my personal opinion. Just wanted to put that out there. So what kind of prompted me to talk about this and add this to the video was there's this larger discourse around ethics and consent of AI models, especially in the AI art sphere. So I don't want to go too deeply into this, but there are a lot of artists that are airing their grievances, and there's lawsuits as well around especially AI model called Stable Diffusion. And what I understand to be the core problem or discourse around it is using AI to create and generate pictures in the style of an existing artist without giving credit to them and claiming as the AI generator's own art. And this kind of gets into the territory of copyright. And I also wanted to kind of approach this from a knitting perspective as well. And Taylor from Wool Needles Hands actually made a video kind of mostly about experimenting with ChatGPT and what it could do for knitting. But I think she starts to get into a little bit about, you know, some discourse that or discussion that we could have about how this might impact knitting designers and knitters generally. So I wanted to add a little bit of commentary, I guess, around that from my perspective. So for me, going back to what I said about AI art and stable diffusion and copyright, what I really wanted to know, first of all, was did OpenAI or ChatGPT or GPT-3, which is the model that ChatGPT is based off of, did they use copyrighted knitting materials, I guess? So I did a little bit of digging. By digging, I mean mostly reading Wikipedia and reading the OpenAI website. So I have this written down in note form because I wanted to make sure that I was able to pull direct quotes. So I'll be looking over here when I'm reading that. So don't worry about it too much. Okay, so does the data set that GPT-3 was trained on include copyrighted knitting materials? So let's get this out of the way. ChatGPT is designed to be a language processing engine and it's not connected to the internet. So what that means, it's pulling its answers from this pre-selected corpus of text, it calls it. And it's not crawling the web real time like a search engine would. That is a different concept from what ChatGPT is supposed to be doing. And so it means that it responds based on data that it knows. And it's what we want to know is like, what is the data that it knows, right? What was it trained on? What was it learning from? So I kind of looked around the internet a little bit, and it seems that the data set, first of all, goes up until 2021. So there is a gap of 2 years or a year, I guess, where it's not pulling that latest information. OpenAI on their website itself states that ChatGPT was trained on the following: a large data set of internet text. So how deeply, like what does that mean, right? What specifically are we talking about when we say internet text? If we look at the paper that OpenAI team released about, training the GPT-3 model, it says that they downloaded and filtered a version of Common Crawl and added high quality reference corpora to the training mix to augment Common Crawl and increase its diversity. So Common Crawl is this open source project that crawls the web and collects information from the web and packages it into, it's basically at this point tetrabytes of databases of information that they find. And they are not specifically filtering for copyrighted materials. There are some boundaries to what Common Crawl collects. There is something that you can put on your website. Generally, you put it in the HTML header, and you can do it two ways. One is called robot.txt, and then the other one is no AI. And that's basically this kind of flag for Common Crawl to look at and say, oh, this page does not want to be archived by us, so it skips that page. But this is not necessarily like industry standard, I suppose. So it can, for any personal blog or whatever, unless you have that built into whatever blogging or system that you're using to host your blog, there is a chance that your content was crawled through by Common Crawl. And 60% of GPT-3 model is trained on Common Crawl. And Common Crawl is currently distributed under the US's fair use claims. So what I understand from that is that they are able to release it for free, but they don't condone, they kind of protect themselves against copyright claims by saying that this is, under the fair use claims, but anybody else who uses this database, they have to do their own work and due diligence of cleaning that information and sanitizing it, I guess, for any copyrighted material. So I guess the short answer here is that given what we know about Common Crawl and its copyright, potentially sensitive materials, that there is some possibility that ChatGPT was trained on user-generated copyright materials, since Common Crawl does contain copyrighted materials and it doesn't filter them themselves. Unless OpenAI went through the data, which is at this point like gigabytes, tetrabytes of information, and then filtered through that copyrighted material, there is a possibility that somebody's blog from 2006 about knitting was used to kind of feed the information for ChatGPT. And we don't know for sure, since OpenAI does not share their source code publicly. Part of the reason why Stable Diffusion were able to know that certain artists were included as part of their database was because they've shared their code publicly for people to look at. Currently, we don't know that for OpenAI and ChatGPT. So what does this mean from like a knitting context, right? So as far as we understand it, as far as knitting related things go, it might have been that ChatGPT was also trained on knitting materials from, turn of the century that were, now copyright free, and it's in the public domain. So that might be why it knows a lot about knitting. But it's also possible that it just, based on the web crawling and the information that is out there about knitting, that is not behind the paywall, that it's collecting its information from there. So I think this kind of promotes this bigger conversation around like how does copyright apply in this age of the internet. And I don't have the answer to this question because I'm just a dude on the internet. I just wanted to get this conversation kind of started because I think it's really interesting. And currently my stance on this, with the use of AI technology and knitting and all of that, or even art generation at all, I think is that personally, I'm going to approach this from a stance of intention. So I think part of the reason why Stable Diffusion and AI art generation has been such a hot topic and a sensitive topic for artists especially is because they've built up the style and skill over the years, decades of them putting in their own knowledge into developing this personal style of how they produce artworks that is now being co-opted by, technically illegally, without consent, by people who are typing prompts to generate these artworks. I think definitely the intentions are different when people are generating images in the style of an artist. So let's say, for example, fan art of Pokemon in the style of James Jean, without recognizing or giving credit to the original artist and claiming it as their own and possibly making profit or gaining clout, I guess, for such said artwork. And so that's kind of the approach that I want to take, where if I said, generate a sweater pattern in the style of a specific knitwear designer, and ChatGPT was able to do that, or any AI model was able to do that, and if I sold that for profit, I think that would be in bad faith. And I think that would be in what I would categorize as bad intention. So I don't mean to condone this technology. Obviously, I made a video about it because I thought it was cool and it could open up a lot of doors for people, especially around like calculation of certain patterns. Maybe you can feed it a section of a pattern that you've designed and have it repeat that over a calculation of a garment, and you could do it in a conversational way instead of punching numbers into an Excel sheet. Maybe that'll work out better for you, but I think I have faith enough in the knitting community and people who consume knitting patterns and knitting material from talented artists out there that we will, if we do decide to use this technology, we'll use it to benefit us and not to put other people down. So that is just my current stance on this. And you know, for now, this was a really fun experiment. I got this rectangle, basically. It's not really a cowl. I got this out of it. And while this was really fun, I don't think I'll be doing anything like this again soon. And for now, I'm going to return to knitting things that I already know what will look like and that I really know that I will enjoy having in my life. So that's it. Just wanted to say that. Happy knitting, everybody. If this is really different from my usual knitting content, but I thought this was interesting, and if you thought so, subscribe. See you later. Bye!